Imagine the scene. The year is 407 BC. The air over the Athenian port of Piraeus hums like a lyre string stretched to its breaking point. It's thick with salt, the smell of fish, sweat, and something else. Hope, mingled with an old, familiar fear. Tens of thousands of eyes are fixed on the sea, toward the horizon where sails have just appeared. This isn't just a returning fleet. It's a dream resurrected. And then, the flagship Trireme, adorned with trophies and purple banners, glides slowly into the harbor. On its high deck, bathed in the Attic sun, stands a figure that looks as if sculpted by Phidias himself. It is him, Alcibiades, son of Clinias, a man this very city had cursed 7 years earlier, stripped of his citizenship and sentenced to death in absentia. A man whose name priests and priestesses had carved onto lead tablets of eternal shame. A man who had fled to his homeland's bitterest enemies, to Sparta, and given them the precise, lethal advice on how to destroy it. A man who then served the Persians, playing the Greeks like pieces on a chessboard. And now the crowd, which should have met him with stones and curses, roars with ecstasy. Women throw flowers into the water, men shout his name, old veterans weep without shame. They see not a traitor, but a savior. They see not an exile, but a living God of victory. He steps ashore and is literally carried on their shoulders, crowned with so many laurel wreaths that, according to Plutarch, he could barely see the path. In this very moment, our central agonizing question is born, a question that pierces the entire fabric of history. Why? Why did Athens, the city of laws, the city that prided itself on its democracy and civic virtue, forgive the one who committed the ultimate crime? Betrayal? What magic did he possess? What demonic or divine power that compelled the most enlightened city in all of Greece to forget its grievances, forgive treason, and time and again place its fate in the hands of its most brilliant and most dangerous son? The answer to this question is not just the story of one man. It is an autopsy of the very soul of Athens, its greatness and its fatal weakness. To understand this paradox, we must dive into the world that created both the monster and the genius. To understand how the city of Socrates and Pericles came to crown a traitor with laurels, we must go back in time, to a world torn apart by war, where the genius of one man seemed the only salvation from inevitable doom. The end of the 5th century BC. The Peloponnesian War has been raging for over 20 years. It is not just a conflict, it's an existential struggle between two worlds, two ideologies: the maritime, democratic, cosmopolitan Athenian empire versus the land-based, oligarchic, isolationist Sparta. The Golden Age, the era of Pericles, when the Parthenon was built and philosophers debated in the agora, has faded into a dim memory. The Great Plague had already wiped out 1/3 of the city's population, including Pericles himself. Now, Athens is a city living under constant strain, under the Damoclean sword of a Spartan spear. But the most devastating blow was not struck by Sparta, but by the Athenians themselves. The disaster in Sicily in 413 BC became Athens' Vietnam, their Afghanistan. The finest army, a massive fleet, tens of thousands of elite warriors, all were lost in a distant adventure. Ancient authors like Thucydides, the dispassionate chronicler of this war, describe scenes that make the blood run cold. Proud Athenian warriors, dying of thirst in the Sicilian river Acinarus, or sold into slavery in the stone quarries. This wound bled at the very heart of the polis. Financial resources were exhausted. Allies began to defect one by one, lured by Spartan gold, which, in turn, was supplied by Persia, the age-old enemy of Greece, now delighting in watching the two Greek hegemons destroy each other. Within Athens itself, democracy, once its greatest strength, began to falter. Constant military failures bred fatigue and disillusionment. The influence of demagogues, who flattered the crowd for short-term gain, grew. Simultaneously, oligarchic conspiracies brewed in the shadows, led by aristocrats who believed democracy was incapable of effectively waging war and that power should belong to the best. Athens was like a ship in a storm, with an exhausted crew, holes in its hull, and a mutiny on deck. It was in this atmosphere of despair and longing for a strong hand, for a miracle, that the demand for a personality like Alcibiades arose. When traditional institutions fail, when old, respected generals lose battle after battle, society begins to search for a savior, a messiah, a man whose genius alone can flip the chessboard. And Athens found such a man. They just didn't know yet that the price for his services would be unbearably high. Into this boiling cauldron of passion and ambition, a boy was born who seemed destined by fate itself to rule. Alcibiades, son of Clinias, came into the world around 450 BC, and his cradle was not made of simple wood, but of pure political gold. On his mother's side, he belonged to the Alcmaeonidae, one of the most ancient, wealthy, and influential families in Athens. This was the clan that gave Athens the reformer Cleisthenes, the father of Athenian democracy, and Pericles himself, the leader of Athens during its golden age. Thus, Alcibiades was not just an aristocrat, he was a political crown prince. After his father's early death in battle, he was raised by his famous uncle Pericles. He grew up in the home of Athens' first citizen, observing the mechanisms of power from childhood, listening to the debates of generals and ambassadors, absorbing the very atmosphere of high politics. But the blood of the Alcmaeonidae carried not only a blessing, but also a curse. A so-called sacrilegious guilt hung over the family from an ancient act of sacrilege, which their enemies periodically used as a political weapon. This shadow of the past may have instilled in Alcibiades a fatalistic sense of his own exceptionalism and, at the same time, his vulnerability. However, the chief sculptor of his soul was not the politician Pericles, but the philosopher Socrates. Their relationship is one of the most dramatic and enigmatic pages of ancient history. Socrates, the unattractive barefoot sage, saw in the dazzlingly handsome and audacious youth something more than just a spoiled aristocrat. He recognized a spark of genius, an incredible intellectual power, and the potential to become either the greatest blessing or the greatest curse for Athens. In his dialogues, Symposium and Alcibiades Befern, Plato paints a vivid picture of their connection. Socrates tries to direct Alcibiades' untamed energy toward virtue, self-knowledge, and service to the state. Alcibiades, in turn, was the only person who, by his own admission, could make him feel shame for a life devoted to the pursuit of glory rather than truth. But this battle for Alcibiades' soul was lost. The allure of power, of the crowd's admiration, of glamour and luxury, proved stronger than philosophical conversations. He was too much of an Athenian, too in love with fame, to become a philosopher. And yet, Socrates' lessons were not in vain. They sharpened his mind, taught him dialectics, the ability to find weak spots in an opponent's argument and to persuade people of anything. Socrates gave him a weapon of incredible power, but he could not place a moral compass in his hands. Fate itself seemed to play along with the sense of exceptionalism that Alcibiades cultivated from a young age. From his youth, legends, omens, and stories began to weave around his figure, setting him apart from his peers and creating an aura of almost divine protection. The most striking and classic example is the Siege of Potidaea in 432 BC. In this grueling campaign, the young aristocrat Alcibiades and the no longer young philosopher Socrates served in the same hoplite unit, sharing a tent and enduring the hardships of military life together. In one fierce skirmish, the Athenians were pushed back, and Alcibiades, fighting bravely, was wounded and fell to the ground. At that moment, as enemy spears were poised to strike him down, Socrates appeared. He stood over his young friend's body, shielded him with his own shield, and, fighting off the enemy, carried him to safety, saving his life. Later, when the command awarded the prize for valor to Socrates, he insisted it be given to Alcibiades, arguing that it was his bravery that deserved the honor. This episode, described by Plato, became a cornerstone of the Alcibiades myth. It not only demonstrated the special, deeply personal bond between the philosopher and his student, but was also presented as a sign that higher powers were protecting Alcibiades for great things. It was as if fate itself was saying, "This man cannot die here. His mission is not yet complete." However, there were other, more sinister omens. His youth was a series of scandals and outrageous acts. He might strike a respected citizen on a dare, or cut off the tail of his magnificent dog, just to make Athenians talk about that instead of his more serious misdeeds. He openly lived with courtesans and threw lavish drinking parties, violating every conceivable norm of decency. This behavior already revealed his defining trait, a contempt for accepted rules, a conviction that he, Alcibiades, was permitted what was forbidden to others. This was a foreshadowing of his future betrayals. A man who does not respect the unwritten laws of society will, at a critical moment, not respect its written laws either. Thus, in his youth, a dual image was already forming. On one hand, a favorite of fortune, marked by the gods and saved by a sage, and on the other, a dangerous disruptor of order, heralding the chaos to come. The formation of Alcibiades' character occurred at the crossroads of the two most powerful intellectual currents of his era, and his soul became a battlefield where not only his personal destiny was decided, but, in a sense, the destiny of Athens itself. On one side of this field stood Socrates. His philosophy was a radical challenge to the entire value system of Athenian society. In a world where success was measured by wealth, fame, and power, Socrates argued that the only thing that mattered was virtue and the care of one's soul. His method, relentless dialectic, the maieutic art, forced his interlocutors to realize their own ignorance, tearing the masks from their false beliefs. For Alcibiades, who was his most beloved and most difficult student, conversations with Socrates were an agonizing experience. The philosopher, like a mirror, showed him the emptiness of his ambitions, the futility of chasing the crowd's admiration. According to Alcibiades himself in Plato's Symposium, Socrates' words made his heart beat faster than any corybantic reveler's, and tears streamed from his eyes. He felt he was living the life of a slave, busying himself with the affairs of Athens while neglecting his own soul. It was a profound, existential clash that Alcibiades constantly experienced. But on the other end of the battlefield stood the sophists, paid teachers of wisdom, like Protagoras and Gorgias. They were the intellectual superstars of their time. Unlike Socrates, they did not seek objective truth. Their goal was to teach the practical skills for success in a democracy. They taught rhetoric, the art of persuasion, the art of making the weaker argument appear stronger. They taught how to manipulate the emotions of the assembly, how to win cases in court, how to build a political career. For Alcibiades, with his boundless thirst for power, the teachings of the sophists were like sweet nectar. They gave him the tools to achieve his goals, They legitimized his ambitions by claiming that justice and morality were relative, and that success was all that mattered. In the end, Alcibiades did not make a final choice. He did something far more complex and dangerous. He synthesized both approaches. From Socrates, he took depth of analysis, the ability to see the essence of a problem, and dialectical sharpness of mind. From the Sophists, he took the techniques of public speaking, a cynical understanding of human psychology, and the skill to use words as weapons. The result was a man with the mind of a philosopher and the morals of a tyrant. He could speak of the good of the state with the sincerity of Socrates, while pursuing his own selfish goals with the unscrupulousness of a sophist. This duality, this ability to combine the incompatible, made him both so irresistible and so destructive for Athens. He was the living embodiment of the intellectual and moral crisis of his time. Before Alcibiades could plunge Athens into its most grandiose adventure, he had to prove his worth to the polis, to demonstrate that behind his youthful audacity and scandalous reputation lay something more. His political debut was a masterpiece of intrigue and strategic thinking, showing the Athenians a glimpse of the genius that would later mesmerize them. The political scene in Athens at that time, following the Peace of Nicias in 421 BC, was divided. The older generation of politicians, led by the wealthy and cautious Nicias, advocated for maintaining peace with Sparta at any cost. They were weary of war and sought stability. Alcibiades, however, led the war party. He believed that peace with oligarchic Sparta was merely a temporary respite, and that Athens should use this time to strengthen its position and forge new alliances for a decisive future strike. His goal was to shatter Spartan hegemony in its very heart, the Peloponnese. He devised a bold and audacious plan to create a coalition of democratic city-states in the Peloponnese, Argos, Mantinea, and Elis, and turn it against Sparta. This was a high-stakes game. Alcibiades personally went to the Peloponnese as an ambassador. He was only about 30 years old, but he negotiated with seasoned politicians, using his entire arsenal: charm, flattery, logical arguments, and veiled threats. He succeeded in forging this alliance, which became a direct threat to Spartan dominance. The culmination of this intrigue was the Battle of Mantinea in 418 BC. Although the Athenians and their allies were defeated by the Spartan phalanx in the battle itself, strategically, Alcibiades achieved his goal. He showed all of Greece that Spartan power was not absolute, that it could and should be challenged. He demonstrated to the Athenians a new, aggressive, and dynamic style of foreign policy that contrasted with the passive caution of Nicias. Most importantly, he established himself as a man capable of thinking on a pan-Hellenic scale, a strategist who was not afraid to take risks for a great cause. The Battle of Mantinea was his first blood in high politics. It didn't bring immediate victory, but it made his name known throughout Greece and built him a reputation in Athens as a future leader, the only one with enough audacity to challenge Sparta and restore Athens to its former glory. It was his first taste of power and fame, and for him, that taste was sweeter than anything else in the world. To truly understand why Alcibiades betrayed, why he so easily crossed the line separating a patriot from a traitor, one must look into the darkest and most secret part of his soul, where his chief demon resided. The name of this demon is philotimia. This Greek word is difficult to translate with a single term. It is not just ambition or love of honor. Philotimia is an all-consuming, passionate, almost erotic love for honors, for glory, for recognition. It is an existential need to be the first, the best, the most talked about, the most praised. For a person possessed by philotimia, the state, the people, friends, all are merely tools for achieving personal glory. steps on the path to one's own deification. And Alcibiades was the absolute, perfect embodiment of this quality. His service to Athens was not an act of patriotism in our sense, but a transaction. He was prepared to bring Athens victory, wealth, and hegemony, but in return, he demanded their unconditional adoration, admiration, and most importantly, power. Athens was a stage for him, on which he played the leading role, and all other citizens were the audience, obliged to applaud. This internal motivation explains many of his seemingly irrational actions. His outrageous antics in his youth were not just boyish mischief, but a way to constantly be the center of attention. His lavish lifestyle, his victories at the Olympic Games, where he entered an unheard-of 7 chariots, all were part of a meticulously constructed image of the greatest of all Hellenes. Unlike Pericles, who remained aloof and spoke to the people only on important matters, Alcibiades lived in public, turning his life into an endless spectacle. And when Athens, his main audience, dared to boo him, that is, when they summoned him to trial on charges of sacrilege, in his value system, this was tantamount to a betrayal on their part. If they were not prepared to acknowledge his preeminence unconditionally, if they placed the laws of the polis above his genius, then, from his point of view, they ceased to be worthy of his service. Therefore, his defection to Sparta and then to Persia was not a tormenting moral choice for him. It was a logical step for a man whose only homeland was his own ego. He did not betray Athens. He simply changed the stage and sought a new audience that would applaud him louder. Thucydides brilliantly captured this essence, writing that the Athenians lost the war not because of the enemy's strength, but because they were mired in internal strife, trying to remove Alcibiades from command. They feared his philotimia, his aspiration for tyrannical power, and this fear ultimately cost them their empire. They could neither trust him completely nor do without him. The peak of Alcibiades' political career, and simultaneously the beginning of his downfall, was the Sicilian Expedition, an enterprise so grandiose in its conception and so catastrophic in its consequences that it still captivates the imagination of historians. In 415 BC, envoys from the Sicilian city of Egesta arrived in Athens, asking for help in their war against their neighbors, Selinus, and their powerful ally, Syracuse. For most Athenians, Sicily was a distant, semi-mythical land, but not for Alcibiades. In this request, he saw a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity, a chance to realize his wildest dream of glory. He became the chief agitator for this war. His speeches in the assembly were masterpieces of rhetoric and psychological manipulation. He painted pictures for the Athenians of Sicily's immense wealth, its fertile lands, and its prosperous cities. He argued that conquering Sicily would make Athens the undisputed hegemon of all of Greece, creating a second, Western empire that would finally break Spartan resistance. He played on every string of the Athenian soul, their imperial pride, their greed, their love of adventure. He persuaded the youth with promises of easy victories and glory. He bribed influential citizens, and he charmed the crowd with his eloquence and confidence. The old and wise Nicias opposed him, trying to dissuade the Athenians from this venture. He pointed out the enormous risks, the lack of information about the enemy's strength, and the fact that Athens would be leaving its homeland defenseless against Sparta. But his sober, cautious speeches were drowned out by a chorus of enthusiastic shouts orchestrated by Alcibiades. In a desperate attempt to scuttle the expedition, Nicias tried reverse psychology. He declared that such a campaign would require forces many times larger than what was planned, hoping the scale of the required expenditure would frighten the citizens. But the effect was the opposite. The Athenians, swept up in euphoria, voted with even greater enthusiasm to dispatch a massive fleet and army. They appointed 3 generals, Alcibiades as the chief ideologue, Nicias, representing the cautious party, and Lamachus, an experienced military commander. Athens, seduced by Alcibiades' dream, placed its bet in the great game. They did not yet know that they had wagered not only their army and fleet, but their very future, and that their brilliant idol would very soon become their worst enemy. Just as the Athenian armada, the most magnificent fleet ever to leave Piraeus, was ready to sail, an event occurred in the city that would forever change the course of history and the fate of Alcibiades. One night, on the eve of departure, unknown vandals mutilated the Hermes, stone pillars depicting the god Hermes that stood throughout the city at crossroads and in front of homes. For the Athenians, this was not just an act of vandalism, but a monstrous sacrilege and a terrible omen. Hermes was the protector of travelers, and insulting him on the eve of the largest naval expedition plunged the city into a state of shock and panic. Who could have done such a thing? In an atmosphere of widespread suspicion and religious terror, Alcibiades' enemies saw their chance. They began to spread rumors linking the crime to him. There was no direct evidence, but his reputation as an impious troublemaker worked against him. At the same time, they revived another, even more serious accusation, that Alcibiades and his friends had held parodies of the sacred Eleusinian mysteries, Athens' greatest religious secret, in their homes. A slave informer claimed to have seen Alcibiades, dressed in the robes of the high priest, showing sacred objects to his drinking companions. This charge of impiety was far more terrifying than the mutilation of the Hermes and was punishable by death. The blow was struck with surgical precision. Alcibiades demanded an immediate trial while he was still in Athens and could defend himself, while the army that idolized him was still in the city. He knew that if he sailed, his enemies would have free rein to turn public opinion against him, but they were craftier. They argued that such an important expedition should not be delayed for a trial, and proposed to postpone it until his return. Alcibiades was forced to agree. He was trapped. He set sail for Sicily as supreme commander, but the Damoclean sword of a death sentence already hung over his head. As soon as the fleet left Athens, his opponents launched a full-scale campaign to discredit him. They found new witnesses and stirred up religious fanaticism and hatred among the people. In the end, the assembly, incited by demagogues, sentenced Alcibiades to death in absentia, ordered the confiscation of his property, and commanded him to return to Athens to face his sentence. The fatal act was committed not by him, but against him, yet it was the trigger for his own, far more terrible crime. News of the death sentence reached Alcibiades in Sicily. The state galley Salaminia arrived with orders for him to follow it back to Athens. The commanders of the Salaminia acted tactfully, not arresting him, but simply requesting that he sail with them to avoid unrest among the troops. Alcibiades faced a choice that would define the rest of his life. He could obey, return to Athens, and face trial. But he knew perfectly well that in the atmosphere of mass hysteria, the trial would be a mere formality, and the verdict a foregone conclusion. A cup of hemlock or death by being thrown from a cliff awaited him. He could have tried to incite a mutiny among the army that loved him, but that would mean starting a civil war in the midst of a military campaign. So he chose a third path, one unthinkable for an Athenian citizen, let alone a general entrusted with the state's army. During a stop in the southern Italian city of Thurii, he and his supporters secretly abandoned their ship at night and fled. When asked if he didn't trust the justice of his own country, he is said to have replied, "I would not trust even my own mother not to mistake a black pebble for a white one." This response reveals the essence of his character. Cynicism, a distrust of democratic institutions, and a conviction of his own righteousness that placed him above the laws of the polis. But his next move shook all of Greece to its foundations. He did not merely become an exile, he went to Sparta. This was equivalent to General Eisenhower defecting to Berlin during World War II and offering his services to Hitler. He appeared before the bitterest mortal enemies of his city, people whose sole purpose was the destruction of Athenian democracy and its empire. This was the first, the loudest, and the most shocking betrayal. He didn't just flee from what he saw as an unjust sentence. He crossed over to the enemy in the midst of a war, carrying with him all of Athens' state and military secrets. At that moment, the brilliant general, the darling of the Athenian people, became a traitor to his homeland. And he did it not for ideological reasons, not for money, but solely out of wounded pride and a desire for revenge against the city that dared to reject him. Upon arriving in Sparta, Alcibiades immediately demonstrated how dangerous an enemy he could be. He didn't just want to survive, he wanted to prove to the Athenians what a colossal mistake they had made by exiling him. And the best way to do that was to bring Athens to the brink of total annihilation. The Spartans, who at first regarded him with suspicion as a soft Athenian aristocrat, were astonished by his adaptability. He grew his hair long, stopped using perfumes, ate coarse food, and bathed in the cold Eurotas River, fully adopting the harsh Spartan lifestyle. But his main weapon was not his Spartan habits, but his mind and his knowledge. At a meeting of the Spartan ephors and kings, he delivered a speech in which he coolly and methodically laid out a plan for the destruction of his own homeland. This plan had 3 key points, each like a dagger aimed at the heart of Athens. First, he insisted on the immediate dispatch of the experienced Spartan general Gylippus to Sicily with reinforcements. He explained that the Athenian army, under the command of the indecisive and ailing Nicias, was bogged down in the siege of Syracuse, and the arrival of a Spartan leader would inspire the Syracusans and lead to the complete rout of the Athenian expedition. This advice proved to be perfectly accurate and became the main cause of the Sicilian disaster. Second, he proposed a change in the very strategy of the war. Until then, the Spartans had only made annual raids into Attica before retreating. Alcibiades advised them to capture and fortify the town of Dasileia, located just 20 kilometers from Athens, and station a permanent garrison there. This was a brilliant and diabolical move. Dasileia became a bone in the throat of Athens. It cut the city off from its silver mines, severed overland trade routes, trapped the Athenians within their long walls, and forced them to live in a state of perpetual siege. Third, he advised Sparta to become active at sea, using Persian gold to build a fleet, and to incite a rebellion among Athens' wealthy Ionian allied cities. He knew exactly which allies were dissatisfied with Athenian rule and ready to revolt. Thus, Alcibiades, the former supreme commander of Athens, single-handedly gave the enemy a complete and detailed plan for the destruction of his own city. It was revenge served cold, calculated, and incredibly effective. Even while in the enemy's camp, actively working to destroy his homeland, Alcibiades could not change his nature, in which limitless genius coexisted with equally limitless arrogance and a lack of self-control. His intellect and strategic advice brought Sparta immense benefits, but his personality and behavior began to provoke increasing irritation and hatred among the Spartan elite. The Spartans were stern, disciplined, and conservative people. Alcibiades, even while adopting their lifestyle, remained an Athenian aristocrat at heart, artistic, sarcastic, and contemptuous of everyone around him. He couldn't resist showing off his intellectual superiority, which deeply offended the Spartan elders. But the final straw was his most audacious and personal transgression. One of the 2 Spartan kings, Augeas II, was commanding the army at Dasileia and was often absent from Sparta, Alcibiades took advantage of this and seduced his wife, Queen Timea. According to Plutarch, Timea was infatuated with the Athenian exile, and when she gave birth to a son, she would whisper his name as Alcibiades among her handmaidens. Alcibiades himself made no secret of the affair, but instead boasted about it, cynically claiming he was motivated not by lust, but by a desire for his descendants to one day rule Sparta. For King Agis, this was not just a personal insult. It was an attack on his honor, the honor of his lineage, and the entire Spartan monarchy. He came to hate Alcibiades with a mortal passion. His influence in Sparta was immense, and he gave a secret order to his commanders in Ionia: kill Alcibiades. Alcibiades, whose intelligence network was superb, learned of the threat in time. He realized his game in Sparta was over. He had provided the Lacedaemonians with invaluable service, but his insufferable character and his hubris had made him an enemy of the most powerful men. His position had become deadly. Once again, he was forced to flee for his life. And this escape marked the beginning of a new, even more complex and cynical phase of his odyssey, a phase in which he would play not for Athens or Sparta, but only for himself. Fleeing from Spartan assassins, Alcibiades performs his next somersault, one that seems even more unbelievable than his flight to Sparta. He seeks refuge with the age-old enemy of all of Greece, the Persian Empire. He arrives at the court of Tissaphernes, the Persian satrap of Lydia and Ionia. This was a move to a completely new level of the great game. If before he was a piece on the Greek chessboard, now he became a player trying to manipulate the entire board. His position was extremely precarious. He was a stateless exile, without an army, hunted by both the Athenians and the Spartans. His only capital was his intellect, and he used it with diabolical virtuosity. He quickly gained the trust of the cunning and treacherous Tissaphernes, becoming his closest advisor on Greek affairs. And here he began his second, even more sophisticated game of betrayal. He started advising Tissaphernes on a policy that was advantageous to Persia, but ruinous for both Greek powers. He convinced the satrap that Persia should not unconditionally support Sparta and aim for its swift and total victory. Instead, Alcibiades argued, Persia should maintain a balance of power. They should help one side, then the other, preventing anyone from gaining a decisive advantage, so that the Athenians and Spartans would exhaust each other in internecine warfare for as long as possible. He advised Tissaphernes to delay wage payments to Spartan sailors, to haggle, to cut subsidies. This divide and conquer policy was classic for Persia, but Alcibiades gave it a new intellectual refinement. He, a Greek, was teaching the Persians how to most effectively play the Greeks against each other. This was a betrayal not just of Athens, but of the entire Hellenic world. He acted as an absolute cynic and pragmatist, for whom concepts like homeland or Hellenic brotherhood didn't exist. There were only centers of power: Athens, Sparta, Persia, and he, Alcibiades, as a free agent, trying to manipulate them all for his own survival and ultimately his return to power. While at the Persian court, he lived in luxury, adopting Persian customs, which charmed Tissaphernes even more. He had reached the depths of moral decay, but simultaneously, the pinnacle of the art of political intrigue. He became the puppet master, pulling the strings from behind the scenes, controlling the course of the greatest war of his time. While at the court of Tissaphernes, Alcibiades began to weave his most complex and risky web, with the goal of a triumphant return to Athens. He knew he wouldn't be forgiven just like that. He needed to offer Athens something so valuable that they would be forced to forget his past sins. And that prize was Persian support, gold, and a fleet. he began to secretly send messages to the Athenian generals and triarchs, commanding the fleet based on the island of Samos. His message was simple and seductive. I can make the Persian king your friend. I can bring you Persian money that will allow you to defeat Sparta. But I will not do this while the democracy I do not trust remains in power in Athens. Overthrow the democracy, establish an oligarchy, bring me back from exile, and I will bring you victory. It was an offer that was impossible to refuse, and at the same time, a diabolical blackmail. He was essentially demanding a coup d'etat as payment for his return. This was the pinnacle of his political cynicism. A man whose career began within democratic procedures was now demanding the destruction of that very democracy. His proposal found a receptive audience among wealthy Athenians and fleet officers, many of whom were already discontented with the rule of the mob. They formed a conspiracy and sent envoys to Athens, led by Pisander, to prepare the ground for a coup. Speaking before the assembly, Pisander stated bluntly that the only chance for salvation was to change the form of government and bring back Alcibiades, as only he could secure an alliance with Persia. The Athenians, driven to despair by military defeats, reluctantly agreed to begin negotiations. Alcibiades, playing the role of the all-powerful intermediary, arranged a meeting between the Athenian envoys and Tissaphernes. During these talks, he behaved like a true puppet master. He deliberately made increasingly outrageous and unacceptable demands on behalf of the Persians, with the aim of sabotaging the negotiations. His goal was not to actually forge an alliance, but to discredit the envoys and show that only he could come to an agreement with the Persians. The intrigue succeeded. The talks failed, but the process was already in motion. The conspirators in Athens, without waiting for further signals, carried out the coup and established the regime of the 400. Thus, Alcibiades, from thousands of miles away, through the sheer force of his intrigue, provoked the fall of the democratic government in his own native city. Events, however, began to unfold in a way that neither Alcibiades nor the oligarchic conspirators had planned. Having established their power in Athens, the oligarchs of the Council of 400 were in no hurry to bring Alcibiades back. They feared him just as much as the Democrats did, understanding that his ambition and popularity would make him uncontrollable. They preferred to try to negotiate a peace with Sparta, but they had overlooked the main factor, the Athenian fleet based at Samos. The sailors and soldiers of the fleet, mostly poor citizens, were the bastion of democracy. When news of the coup in Athens reached them, they were furious. They refused to obey the usurpers, removed their generals who were suspected of sympathizing with the oligarchy, and remained loyal to the democratic constitution. In effect, two Athenian states were formed, the oligarchic city and the democratic fleet. And this fleet, finding itself without recognized leaders and in a state of complete uncertainty, took the most paradoxical and fateful step in this entire story. Influenced by staunch Democrats like Thrasybulus, the sailors and soldiers voted in a general assembly to recall Alcibiades from exile and elect him as their general. The logic of this decision was both desperate and flawless. They hated him for his betrayal, but they understood that he was the only man with enough military genius and diplomatic weight to save the situation. They believed his promises of Persian aid. They knew that only he could match the talent of the Spartan commanders. The irony of fate was simply astounding. The man who had just provoked an anti-democratic coup was now being called upon to lead the forces of democratic resistance against that very coup. The democracy he had tried to destroy now saw him as its only savior. This was the turning point. Alcibiades, an exile hunted by everyone, suddenly found himself once again at the head of the most powerful military force Athens possessed. Fate had given him another chance, and not only his own future, but the very existence of the Athenian state depended on how he used it. Alcibiades' arrival at Samos was met with jubilation. He was back where he wanted to be, at the center of the action, at the head of a huge army, adored by his soldiers. The first impulse of the impassioned sailors was to immediately sail the entire fleet to Piraeus, overthrow the oligarchs, and restore democracy. It was a natural and understandable desire, but it would have been suicidal for Athens. If the Athenian fleet had abandoned its positions in Ionia, the Spartans would have immediately seized the Hellespont and cut off Athens from its grain supply from the Black Sea, which would have meant famine and inevitable surrender. Moreover, a march on Athens would have meant the beginning of a full-scale civil war. Athenians would have started killing Athenians, while the Spartan enemy was at the gates. And in this critical, fateful moment, Alcibiades performed his first great act on the path to redemption. He, known for his recklessness and egoism, this time showed incredible statesmanship and restraint. He addressed the army, and, using all his powers of persuasion, talked them out of an immediate march on Athens. He explained the strategic risks, urging them to direct their anger not at their fellow citizens, but at the common enemy, the Spartans. He promised that he would deal with the oligarchs, but later, through diplomacy, without plunging the state into a fratricidal war. This was an incredibly difficult decision. It would have been much easier for him to follow the crowd, lead a crusade on Athens, and riding the wave of popular anger, return to the city as a dictator. But he chose the harder, more responsible path. This act was of colossal importance. According to the historian Thucydides, on that day, Alcibiades rendered his country a service second to none. He saved Athens from a civil war that would have inevitably destroyed it. This was the first act of his forgiveness. He began to pay for his past sins, not with words, but with deeds. And this was only the beginning. He knew that he could only earn full forgiveness on the battlefield by proving his indispensability through victories. And he was ready to give Athens those victories. Having gained real power and the trust of the fleet, Alcibiades immediately unleashed his whirlwind of activity, and the results were not long in coming. He was like a surgeon called to a hopeless patient, and with incredible speed and precision, he began to perform one successful operation after another. His energy seemed inexhaustible, and his military genius, honed by years of intrigue and service to various masters, now shone in all its glory. His first target was to crush the Spartan fleet, which, under the command of Navarch Mindarus, dominated the Hellespont region. Alcibiades, joining forces with other Athenian generals, began to hunt the Spartans. The first major clash occurred at Cynossema, where the Athenians won an important but not decisive victory. And then, in 410 BC, came the Battle of Cyzicus, which became one of the greatest masterpieces of naval tactics in ancient history. Alcibiades used his favorite trick. With a small squadron of ships, he lured the Spartan fleet out of the harbor of Cyzicus, pretending to retreat. When the Spartans, confident in their numerical superiority, gave chase, the main forces of the Athenian fleet under the command of Thrasybulus and Theramenes suddenly appeared from behind coastal headlands, cutting off the Spartans' escape route. At the same time, a heavy rain began to fall, concealing the Athenians' maneuvers. The Spartans were trapped. They were forced to land and fight on shore, where they were attacked by Athenian infantry that Alcibiades had landed nearby in advance. The rout was complete. The entire Spartan fleet, down to the last ship, was either captured or destroyed. The Spartan Navarch Mindarus himself fell in battle. The Athenians intercepted a dispatch sent by the surviving Spartans to Sparta, a model of laconic grief. Ships lost. Mindarus is dead. The men are starving. We don't know what to do. This victory had a stunning effect. It completely changed the strategic situation in the war. Athens was once again master of the seas. Sparta was so demoralized that it offered peace on the basis of the status quo. But the Athenian people, intoxicated by success, rejected the offer. The victory at Cyzicus transformed Alcibiades in the eyes of the Athenians from a dubious exile into a national hero. He had proven by his actions that he was their only chance for victory. And this was just the first of his great victories on the road home. The victory at Cyzicus was not just a tactical success, it was a catalyst that set off a chain reaction, restoring Athens' maritime empire. Alcibiades did not rest on his laurels. He knew he had to strike while the iron was hot. For the next 3 years, from 410 to 407 BC, he single-handedly waged a campaign to regain control of the region vital to Athens, the Black Sea Straits. This was the artery through which grain from the Black Sea region flowed to the starving city. Whoever controlled the Hellespont controlled the life of Athens. Acting with incredible speed and determination, Alcibiades moved from one siege to another, from one naval operation to the next. First, he took Perinthus and Selymbria. Then he laid siege to Chalcedon on the Asiatic side of the Bosporus. During this siege, he defeated an army sent by the Persian satrap Pharnabazus to relieve the city. After that, he forced Chalcedon to rejoin the Athenian Empire and pay tribute. But the crown jewel of his victories was to be Byzantium, the future Constantinople, the strategically crucial city controlling the entrance to the Black Sea. The siege of Byzantium was long and difficult. The city was defended by a strong Spartan garrison. But here, too, Alcibiades used his favorite method, combining military force with cunning and diplomacy. He entered into secret negotiations with a group of citizens inside the city who were dissatisfied with Spartan rule. One night, his supporters opened the gates to the Athenians. The Athenian troops stormed the city. After a fierce street battle, the Spartan garrison was forced to surrender. The capture of Byzantium was a triumph. Athens now had complete control of the straits. Grain supplies were restored. The Athenian treasury began to fill up again from the tolls levied on passing ships. In 3 years, Alcibiades, commanding a fleet that sustained itself on the spoils of war, had managed to almost completely restore what had been lost after the Sicilian disaster. He wasn't just winning battles, he was resurrecting an empire. Every piece of news about his victories that reached Athens further erased the memory of his past betrayals. The image of the traitor was gradually replaced by that of the invincible commander, the miracle worker who single-handedly turned back the wheel of history. Athens, starved for victories, was ready to forgive him everything. They were waiting for their hero. And then, the moment arrived. In the summer of 407 BC, Alcibiades decided the time was right for his return. He gathered a fleet laden with trophies and set sail for the shores of Attica. Even then, he acted with caution. He first landed not in Athens itself, but nearby, sending scouts to find out what kind of reception awaited him. He still feared his enemies, but his fears were groundless. Athens awaited him like a messiah. And so we return to the scene where our story began. His triumphant return to Piraeus was the apotheosis of his life. The assembly immediately passed a decree clearing him of all charges. All his confiscated property was returned. The priests who had once cursed him were now required to perform a ritual of purification and publicly revoke their curses. The pinnacle of his glory was his appointment as strategos autocrator, supreme commander of all land and sea forces with unlimited powers. No one in Athens had held such power since Themistocles. It was the peak of his might, the moment of his absolute triumph. And he marked it with a brilliant symbolic gesture designed to demonstrate to all of Greece the return of Athenian power. For many years, the sacred procession in honor of the Eleusinian mysteries, which was supposed to travel by land from Athens to Eleusis, had been conducted by sea, because the land route was controlled by the Spartan garrison at Decelea. Alcibiades announced that he would lead the procession by land, as in the good old days, under the protection of the entire Athenian army. It was an incredibly risky but brilliant PR move. He drew up his troops and, under their protection, escorted the priests and initiates along the sacred road. The Spartans from Decelea, seeing the entire Athenian army before them, led by its celebrated commander, did not dare to attack. The procession passed without a single incident. For the Athenians, it was a true miracle. It was not just a military revival, but a religious and moral one. Alcibiades had not only given them back their empire, he had given them back their gods and their dignity. At that moment, he probably believed in his own divinity, his own infallibility. It was classic Greek hubris, the pride that blinds a hero at the zenith of his glory and inevitably leads to his fall. He stood on top of the world, not knowing that an abyss was already opening beneath his feet. After his triumphant return and restoration of status, Alcibiades set out on a new campaign to consolidate his successes in Ionia. The Athenians expected new, even greater victories from him. The pressure was immense. However, he faced a mundane but intractable problem: a lack of money. The Athenian treasury was empty, and he had no funds to pay the rowers and soldiers. He was constantly forced to divert his attention from military operations to fundraising, squeezing money from allied cities. During one such absence, he left the main fleet at the port of Notium, near Ephesus. He entrusted the command to his personal friend and helmsman, Antiochus, a brave but strategically incompetent man. Alcibiades left him one absolutely categorical order. Under no circumstances was he to engage the Spartan fleet, which was stationed nearby at Ephesus. The Spartans at that time were commanded by a new, extremely talented and cunning novarch, Lysander. He was a commander of a completely new type, an atypical Spartan, a master of intrigue, diplomacy, and bribery, no less cunning than Alcibiades himself. Lysander, learning that Alcibiades was away, decided to provoke the Athenians into a fight. Antiochus, eager for glory and wanting to prove his own worth, fell into the trap. With a few ships, he approached Ephesus and began to maneuver provocatively in front of the Spartans. Lysander initially sent a small force against him. Antiochus charged, and at that moment, the main Spartan fleet emerged from the harbor. The Athenian ships, coming out of Notium one by one in disarray to help their vanguard, became easy prey for the organized Spartans. As a result, the Athenians suffered a significant, though not catastrophic, defeat. About 15 triremes were lost. Antiochus himself was killed. This was the first defeat for the Athenian fleet under the supreme command of Alcibiades. From a military standpoint, it was minor, but politically, it was fatal for him. The storm clouds were already gathering over his head. News of the defeat at Notium reached Athens and had the effect of an exploding bomb. For Alcibiades' numerous enemies, who had been lying low since his triumphant return, this was a long-awaited gift from fate. They immediately launched a furious campaign against him in the assembly. They accused him of everything, of neglecting his duties by leaving the fleet in the hands of an incompetent man, of trading the war for entertainment with Ionian courtesans and drunkenness, and most importantly, of still aspiring to tyrannical power. The defeat, however small, was presented as proof of his incompetence and treacherous designs. In this situation, the full fickleness and ingratitude of the Athenian people became apparent. The crowd that just a few months earlier had carried Alcibiades on their shoulders and was ready to proclaim him king, now just as easily believed his detractors. Their love was shallow, based not on respect and trust, but on the expectation of a continuous stream of miracles and victories. As soon as the stream was interrupted, love instantly turned to suspicion and hatred. They forgot about Cyzicus, about Byzantium, about regaining control of the straits. A single defeat, for which he was not even directly to blame, overshadowed all his achievements. The Athenians could not rise to the understanding that even a genius can face difficulties, that war consists not only of victories, but also of defeats. They demanded divine infallibility from their idol, and when he showed human vulnerability, they rejected him. In the next election for generals, Alcibiades was not re-elected. 10 new commanders were appointed in his place. For him, this was a clear signal. His credit of trust had run out, and another trial on trumped-up charges awaited him. The love of Athens proved to be as bright, passionate, and fleeting as Alcibiades' own character. He was their mirror image, and now that mirror had cracked. He had tasted the full bitterness of the fall from the pinnacle of glory. Realizing that the clouds had gathered over his head for good, Alcibiades did not wait for his enemies to strike the final blow. Experience had taught him that Athenian justice, when guided by political hatred, was indistinguishable from a lynching. He was not going to entrust his life a second time to the fickle mood of the crowd. Without waiting for his official dismissal and summons to Athens, he left the fleet and went into a second, this time voluntary, exile. He went to his personal estates in the Thracian Chersonese, a fortified castle he had prudently acquired, as if foreseeing such an outcome. This second exile was fundamentally different from the first. The first time, he fled as a man accused of sacrilege, a man whose reputation was tarnished. Now, he was leaving as a victor, as the savior of his country, who had been rejected by that very country over a minor setback and political intrigues. There was bitterness and resentment in his departure, but no guilt. He left his city again, but this time it was not he who betrayed Athens, but, from his point of view, Athens that had betrayed him. He left the Athenian fleet in the care of 10 new generals, most of whom were brave men, but who possessed not 1/100th of his talent and experience. He settled in his castle, gathered a band of mercenaries, and began to live the life of an independent Thracian dynast, raiding local tribes. He watched the war from the sidelines, like a spectator at a tragedy whose ending he already knew. He saw the mistakes made by the new Athenian commanders, saw how the cunning and ruthless Lysander was gradually seizing the initiative. He was removed from the great game, but his mind continued to work, analyzing the situation. Fate was preparing one last, most tragic appearance for him on the stage, where he was destined to play the role of Cassandra, a prophet whose predictions no one would believe. The year is 405 BC. The Peloponnesian War is nearing its tragic conclusion. The entire Athenian fleet, the last hope of the Republic, numbering about 180 triremes, has entered the Hellespont and anchored off a deserted coast at a place called Aegospotami, which translates to Goat Rivers. Directly opposite, on the other side of the strait, in the well-equipped port of Lampsacus, lay the Spartan fleet under the command of Lysander. The position chosen by the Athenian generals was monstrously vulnerable. They had no proper harbor, no nearby source of food. Supplies had to be brought from the distant city of Sestos. Every day, the Athenian fleet sailed out in full battle formation and challenged the Spartans to a fight. But Lysander ignored the challenge, and every evening, the Athenian ships returned to their inconvenient anchorage, and the crews dispersed along the shore in search of food. From his nearby castle, Alcibiades watched this deployment with growing horror. He, better than anyone, understood the mortal danger the Athenians were in. He saw that Lysander was simply waiting for the right moment for a surprise attack. Unable to remain a passive spectator, he mounted his horse and rode to the Athenian camp. He approached the generals, among them men like Tydeus and Menander, and tried to open their eyes to their fatal mistake. He begged them to move the fleet to the safe harbor of Sestos, where they would have both a port and supplies. He pointed out that in their current position, they were completely defenseless. He even offered his help. He would bring troops from his Thracian king allies and force Lysander to either fight on land or leave. It was the last gesture of a desperate patriot. But the Athenian generals, drunk with their power and filled with envy of his glory, met him with arrogant contempt. They told him, "We are in command now, not you. Get out." They effectively accused him of trying to spoil their victory and claim their glory for himself. Rejected and humiliated, Alcibiades rode away, remarking as he left that he only feared the enemy would attack and destroy them all. It was his final prophecy. Alcibiades' words proved prophetic, and the end came with terrifying speed. For several days, Lysander had observed the routine of the Athenian fleet. He saw how the Athenians sailed out every morning, then returned in the evening, and, convinced of their impunity, scattered along the shore. On the 5th day, after the Athenian fleet had once again returned to Aegospotami without a fight, Lysander gave the order. He waited until the Athenian crews had left their ships, and then launched his entire fleet in a swift attack across the strait. It was no longer a battle, it was a massacre. The Athenians were caught completely by surprise. Most of them didn't even have time to get back to their ships. The Spartans captured the empty triremes one after another. Only a handful of ships under the command of the general Conon, which were on alert, managed to break through and escape to sea. The rest of the fleet, more than 160 ships, was captured or destroyed. Several thousand Athenian citizens were taken prisoner. Lysander ordered the execution of all captives, except for one general, in retaliation for atrocities the Athenians had previously committed against their enemies. The disaster at Aegospotami was absolute. It was a death sentence for Athens. Having lost its last fleet, the city lost everything: the ability to protect its sea lanes, to import grain, to control its allies. The historian Xenophon describes how the news of the rout reached Athens. A cry of grief passed from person to person, traveled from Piraeus up the long walls to the city itself. That night, no one in Athens slept. They mourned not only the dead, but also themselves, realizing that they now faced inevitable retribution for all their years of imperial arrogance. The apocalypse that Alcibiades had foreseen and desperately tried to prevent had come to pass. His rejected advice became the epitaph on the grave of Athens' naval empire. He had been right, but that rightness could no longer change anything. After Sparta's crushing victory in the Peloponnesian War and the fall of Athens, Alcibiades, watching all this from his Thracian castle, found himself in an extremely ambiguous and dangerous position. He had become a man who was not only unnecessary, but also dangerous to all the major players on the new political stage. For the Spartans, who had established their hegemony over Greece, he was a constant source of anxiety. They knew his genius for intrigue, his unpredictability, and his ability to change the balance of power at any moment all too well. They feared he might rally the remnants of Athenian resistance or make a deal with the Persians and start the war anew. The victors had no need for such geniuses. For the new rulers of Athens, the so-called 30 tyrants, an oligarchic junta installed by Sparta and led by Critias, Alcibiades was a mortal threat. Critias, who had once been part of Alcibiades' circle, now saw him as the potential leader of a democratic comeback. a man whose name alone could incite the people to rebellion. Therefore, the Athenian tyrants appealed to their Spartan patron, Lysander, with an urgent request to eliminate Alcibiades. Finally, he had become an inconvenient figure for the Persians as well. While the war was on, his advice had been valuable, but now that Spartan hegemony was established in Greece, his intrigues could only destabilize the situation. Lysander, using his immense influence over the Persian satrap Pharnabazus, relayed the order from the Spartan ephors. Alcibiades must die. The fate of the greatest adventurer of his time was decided behind the closed doors of the victors. He who had survived dozens of battles, escaped death sentences, and outwitted the most cunning politicians, was now simply erased from the list of the living as an unnecessary and dangerous figure. He was forced to flee Thrace and seek refuge in Phrygia, in Asia Minor, still hoping to reach the Persian king Artaxerxes and offer him his services. But the noose was already tightening around his neck. The inexorable move toward the end had begun. The end of Alcibiades' life was as dramatic, unconventional, and, in some ways, pathetic as his entire biography. He had settled in a small Phrygian village with his last love, a courtesan named Timandra. One night he had a dream. He was dressed in Timandra's clothes, and she was painting his face like a woman's. Waking in a cold sweat, he understood it was a dream of his own death. That very night, the house where he slept was surrounded by assassins sent by Pharnabazus on Spartan orders. The killers, among whom were relatives of those Alcibiades had wronged, did not dare to enter and fight him face to face. They feared him even unarmed. Instead, they piled brushwood around the house and set it on fire. Awakening to the smell of smoke and the crackle of flames, Alcibiades instantly assessed the situation. His end was not a heroic death in battle, but an ironic and brutal execution. But even in this final moment, he did not surrender. He wrapped his cloak around his left arm to use as a makeshift shield, and in his right hand, he grabbed a dagger. His sword had burned in the fire. Together with one of his companions, he rushed out of the burning house with a shout, straight at the assassins. This final charge was an act of pure defiance against fate. But his enemies did not accept the challenge. Seized by panic, they fell back and did not dare to engage him in hand-to-hand combat. Instead, they began to hurl javelins and shoot arrows at him from a distance. Alcibiades, the great general, the victor of Cyzicus, the man whose very sight inspired terror in entire armies, fell into the dust, pierced by the arrows of cowards, never reaching his foes. His death was deeply symbolic. He who had lived his whole life playing by his own rules, scorning conventions, died outside the rules of the heroic epic. He was denied a fair fight. Fate, which he had so often tried to cheat, finally caught up with him in the most humiliating way. After the assassins fled, leaving his lifeless body on the ground, Timandra emerged from the burning house. She was the only one who had stayed with him until the very end. She took up his body, covered in wounds, and using her own expensive clothes and fabrics, gave him as lavish and dignified a burial as was possible in that wild place. This final act of loyalty, performed by a woman whom Athenian society considered fallen, was a bitter and ironic epilogue to the life of a man who had been welcomed in the homes of kings and had led nations. He was abandoned by his allies, betrayed by his fellow citizens, and killed by his enemies. Only a courtesan saw him to his final resting place. The death of Alcibiades in 404 BC marked the end of an era. It was not just a man who had passed, but a symbol of the boundless possibilities and equally boundless dangers inherent in Athenian democracy during its rise and fall. His death, like his life, left behind more questions than answers, becoming food for thought for philosophers and historians for centuries to come. He never returned to Athens. His odyssey ended in a nameless Phrygian village, far from the city he had so passionately loved and just as passionately hated. His journey, which began in the splendor of an aristocratic home and in the agora beside Socrates, ended in fire and smoke under the arrows of mercenaries. The circle had closed, leaving behind only a trail of blood and a legend. The legacy of Alcibiades proved to be as contradictory and multifaceted as the man himself. After his death, his figure did not fade into oblivion, but instead became the subject of fierce debate, transforming into an enduring symbol that each era interpreted in its own way. For his contemporaries and immediate successors, he was, above all, a living and bleeding wound. The historian Thucydides, who created the most profound and objective portrait of Alcibiades, reaches a paradoxical conclusion. He believes that the main reason for Athens' defeat in the war was precisely the removal of Alcibiades from command. In Thucydides' view, he was the only man with enough genius to bring the war to a victorious conclusion. The Athenians, by exiling him out of fear of his personal habits and the scale of his ambitions, essentially committed suicide, depriving themselves of their most effective weapon. Thus, for Thucydides, the tragedy of Alcibiades is the tragedy of Athens' own short-sightedness. We find a completely different interpretation in the works of the philosopher Plato. For him, Alcibiades is not so much a historical figure as a philosophical case study, the greatest example of what happens to a brilliant nature that is not ennobled by true virtue and knowledge. In the dialogues Symposium and Alcibiades the Furnf, Plato portrays him as a man endowed with all gifts, intelligence, beauty, lineage, but who squandered them in the pursuit of false goals, power and glory. His relationship with Socrates is presented as a missed chance for the salvation of his soul. Alcibiades is an eternal reminder that genius without a moral foundation leads not to creation, but to destruction, both for the individual and for society. For the Romans, like Cornelius Nepos, he was a fascinating character whose life read like an adventure novel. For the Renaissance, he became the embodiment of the titanic individual who knows no bounds. In modern times, his biography has become a classic example for analyzing the relationship between a charismatic leader and democracy. Thus, Alcibiades never received a definitive judgment. He remained an eternal question. Was he a genius, destroyed by an imperfect society, or a monster who nearly destroyed a great city? The answer most likely lies in the fact that he was both at the same time, and it is in this unresolved contradiction that his eternal fascination lies. And so, we return to our main question, to the paradox that prompted us to begin this journey. Why did Athens, the city of laws and reason, forgive a man who had twice betrayed them, handing the enemy a plan for their destruction? Now, having traced his entire path, we can give a final, multi-layered answer. Athens forgave him not in spite of who he was, but precisely because of who he was. Alcibiades was not just an Athenian citizen. He was the ultimate, concentrated expression of the very spirit of Athens of his time. He was their mirror, and looking into it, the Athenians saw themselves, only on an exaggerated, grotesque scale. He was as brilliant, eloquent, artistic, and audacious as Athens itself in its finest hour. But he was also as arrogant, reckless, insatiable in his ambitions, and morally flexible as the Athenian Empire in its pursuit of power. In forgiving Alcibiades, the Athenian people were subconsciously forgiving themselves for the Sicilian adventure, for their imperial pride, for their willingness to place the ends above the means. Secondly, His forgiveness was an act of desperation. At a critical moment in the war, after the Sicilian disaster, Athens was on the brink of collapse. They needed not just a good general, they needed a miracle. And Alcibiades was a master of creating miracles. He had a unique ability to inspire hope where none remained. His charisma was like a drug that made the Athenians believe once again in their own greatness, in their chosen destiny. They needed him because only he could give them the intoxicating feeling of victory, even when everything around them was crumbling. And he gave them those victories. Cyzicus, Byzantium. He paid for his pardon with hard currency, a rescued empire. And finally, the deepest reason for his forgiveness was articulated in Aristophanes' comedy, The Frogs, where the god Dionysus asks what to do about Alcibiades. He receives the answer in the form of an old proverb. One should not rear a lion in the city, but if one has been reared, one must humor its ways. Alcibiades was such a lion. Athens itself had nurtured him with its admiration, its ambitions, its democracy that offered limitless opportunities for demagoguery. And when this lion grew up, he became too strong and too dangerous to be kept in the cage of the law, but also too necessary in battle to be discarded. They forgave him because they had no choice. He was their beautiful evil, their necessary monster, without whom they could neither win nor live. The story of Alcibiades is not just the biography of one of the most brilliant individuals of antiquity. It is an eternal parable, a universal lesson about the tragic and unresolved conflict that lies at the heart of any democratic society. It is the conflict between the individual and the law, between genius and the system. Alcibiades embodied a type of person who appears at historical turning points, charismatic, brilliant, convinced of their own exceptionalism, and therefore believing they have the right to stand above accepted norms and laws. Such people are capable of creating miracles, leading nations, and winning hopeless wars. But they also carry within them the seeds of tyranny and destruction, because their boundless ego is incompatible with the idea of equality before the law, upon which democracy rests. Athens, in turn, faced a dilemma that remains relevant for any free society today. What is to be done with such a person? Can you afford not to use their talents in a critical situation, even knowing the threat they pose to the very foundations of the state? And can you survive by trusting them completely and giving them unlimited power? The story of Alcibiades gives a tragic negative answer to both these questions. By exiling him the first time, Athens suffered the disaster in Sicily. By bringing him back and trusting him, they gained several years of brilliant victories, only to exile him again out of the same suspicion and fear, which led to the final defeat at Aegospotami. Athens could neither live with Alcibiades nor live without him. Therein lies the deepest tragedy. He was both the poison and the cure in the same bottle. His story is an eternal warning about how easily a democracy, seduced by promises of swift salvation and greatness, can become dependent on a brilliant adventurer, and how that dependence ultimately destroys both the hero and the society that created him. The tragedy of Alcibiades is, in the end, an inseparable part of the tragedy of the great and contradictory city of Athens itself.